There is a whole body of research that's developing in the area of leadership which looks at leadership as a process rather than as a quality that an individual possesses. And I felt that that approach was particularly relevant in the context of professional service firms because it acknowledges that leadership is plural. So leadership is something that happens, in a sense, in the spaces between, in the interactions between individuals. And from that, I developed the concept of the leadership constellation, which is a way of understanding better the underlying power dynamics, the hidden power structures within these kinds of organisations, to find out who the real leaders are, rather than the people who like to think of themselves as leaders. It'll typically start out with what I call the leadership dyad, which is often a senior partner and a managing partner, or a chairman and chief executive, working sometimes very closely together. Then it'll be the heads of major business areas, whether it's countries, regions, or particular kinds of service lines. Then it may, in some firms, involve the heads of business services, particularly the CFO or the COO or the head of HR. But what I was particularly interested in was the fourth group, who are called the key influencers. And these are people who don't necessarily have any formal leadership position, may not really appear on an organisation chart, but they are the ones who control access to key client relationships or who have particularly valuable specialist technical expertise. And this gives them tremendous power within these kinds of organisations. What I've been doing is spending a lot of time getting to know three firms really well: the senior leadership group, the key influencers, the power brokers within the firms, understanding how they work together and sometimes how they don't work together very well. Firm A was a global leader. It was a tremendously successful organisation. And for the first few weeks I spent there, I was really puzzled and confused. I couldn't make sense of what I was hearing and what I was observing, and I started to doubt myself as a researcher, until I realised that that was essentially the story. That was the point of what I was observing, that it was inherently ambiguous, it was confusing, and frankly quite muddled. What you had was a senior partner and managing partner who had very little formally defined authority, whose roles were not clearly delineated. You had a board that was responsible for oversight of the executive, but yet contained executive members. There was nothing like an executive committee or a management committee, but there was an informally organised sort of management team that came together from time to time, but it was fairly loosely constituted. And the practices were always led by at least two people, sometimes three, with very different titles, very different roles, who'd sort of evolved these positions, ways of working together on an ad hoc basis. What I also found was that all of these people who were involved in this leadership dynamic felt that it worked extremely effectively, and they were very supportive of it and very comfortable with it. And I wanted to understand why, because it just didn't make much sense to me. What I realised was the key to all this was social embeddedness. And by social embeddedness, what I mean is the deep relationships of trust that develop amongst people who've worked together for a long time. And this was an organisation where that social embeddedness was very, very high and very, very highly developed. So come the recession, they recognised that they were going to need to make substantial culls amongst the senior professionals, amongst the partners. And as you can imagine, that was extremely distressing for them, precisely because of these very high levels of social embeddedness. And the senior partner and the managing partner had absolutely no constitutional authority to do that. What they decided to do, rather than go to a full vote of the partnership, which they felt could have been very damaging to the firm, was to conduct the whole process of selecting partners for culling in secret. And it began with a very small group of people, just 8 initially, getting together, talking about how to do it, starting to identify partners, starting to analyse data, challenging each other, bringing in more people, challenging, recommending, going round and round the process until more and more people were co-opted into the whole process of identifying the partners to be culled. The senior partner and the managing partner, meanwhile, stayed out of these discussions, but they stayed in touch with all the people who were doing the analysis and going through the deliberations, getting them to justify their decisions, nudging them, pushing them a little bit further, and making decisions about who to co-opt into the process. The cuts went deep and could have been potentially very threatening to the fabric of the partnership as a whole. But because the partnership could see and understand in retrospect the process that had gone through and felt that it had been done appropriately, ultimately they were able to pull off this fairly traumatic event in the life of the partnership and come out safely the other side. So what this study demonstrated was that it's possible for a leader with no formal authority whatsoever to behave as if they have considerable power by operating under the cloak of ambiguity. So the theme of ambiguity that was so important when I began my research, I came to understand was actually a source of power to the individuals who understood it and who were able to navigate it effectively. Well, Firm B, which was the second firm I studied, was also a global leader in its sector. And there it proved remarkably difficult to identify the leadership constellation. When I asked people to talk about the leaders in the firm and to identify the leaders in the firm, I got an extraordinary variety of responses, from naming about 200 people or more, all the partners, to progressively smaller and smaller numbers of people. So I thought of this firm as the organisation where everyone and yet no one was a leader. And I wanted to try and understand how on earth that worked. And there were clues to me in some of the comments that people had said. They would say things like, "We only have places in our ranks for zealous family members." And I came to understand that there was this very, very intense sense of belonging to this organisation, in spite of the fact that they didn't have the same kind of social embeddedness that I was observing in Firm A. Unlike Firm A, most of these people had joined the firm from established successful careers in other organisations and indeed in other sectors. Yet they had been able to, in effect, manufacture this sense of social embeddedness, to manufacture trust, through a series of quite strong social control systems. And in the process, these individuals were being very carefully selected and, in effect, groomed to belong to this organisation. So having brought together a collection of like-minded people who were tremendously enthusiastic and excited about being part of this organisation, it actually became possible to lead it fairly effectively with these very loose and amorphous control systems in place. The chairman was at the centre of this organisation, the centre of this web, in effect. And he would spend his days on the phone, working time zones all around the world, talking to people, making sure things were all right, making sure they were aligned with the overall message of the organisation, asking them if they needed help. And in the process, also being comfortable with the fact that if anything was going wrong, he would get the call, if not from the leader of a particular office, then from the immediate leadership team around that individual. When the recession hit with them, the chairman and the senior leadership team spoke to the key office heads and explained the need to cut costs, but didn't give them a particular target, asked them to think about it. They then spoke to the other people within their organisation, within their office, and because of this strong sense of family feeling, it was almost as though they were competing with each other to see who could sacrifice more. Although throughout the process the chairman had steered it, had guided it, and had probably all along had a sense of where he needed to get to, the people within the offices felt that it had been their decision. They never felt controlled or imposed upon. The answer to the question I posed myself, how can this firm work when everyone and no one is a leader, comes down to understanding these powerful social control mechanisms and the role of the chairman in that as embodying those social control mechanisms. The people within the firm have been carefully selected and groomed to only want what is good for the firm. And because it's what they also want, they are very comfortable with that. The chairman's role is to keep them in line and to keep them broadly moving together. It's a much overused cliche to talk about leading professional service firms as like herding cats. What in effect is happening in Firm B is the cats are constructing their own cages, but they're very happy cats who are living in very nice cages, which give them just the right amount of room to roam around in. My study of Firm C really took me to the dark side of leadership dynamics, and like the other two firms, it was a global leader in its sector. It also had a long-established tradition of what they referred to as niceness. Partners were nice, by and large, to each other, and it was, by and large, a nice place to work. There was a high level of social embeddedness within this organisation. But things started going horribly wrong amongst the leadership, within the leadership group. And it began, first of all, with a series of international mergers, which became enormously time-consuming for the leadership dyad, and became very frustrating for the other people who weren't seeing any direct, tangible benefits coming through. And this started to come to a head as members within the executive committee fought with each other for the sake of their own practices and stopped really thinking in any collective sense and started thinking about advancing the interests of the practices that they were representing. And the leadership dyad were really unable to get any traction to try and change this because the practice heads had so much influence with the rest of their partners. The chairman announced that he wasn't standing for another term, and that brought matters to a head because a number of people throughout the firm put themselves forward to be elected as the next chairman, including a number of members of the executive committee. And at that point, the hostility became overt. So a number of senior partners who were not directly involved in the executive committee decided that it was very important to manage the selection process effectively to ensure that all the partners were involved and had a chance to talk to the candidates and express their own views about what they expected from the next chairman of the organisation. So they created a series of meetings all around the firm where the partners were able to do just this. And this was an important part of the catharsis, but also an important part of the healing process for the partnership, who had been quite traumatised by what had happened. So for me, this highlighted two important things. First of all, what happens when there is an irretrievable breakdown of social embeddedness. And what this also illustrated was the healing power of partnership, because ultimately it was partners outside the immediate leadership group who stepped forward, who took on leadership responsibility and worked out a way of resolving the problems. And ultimately that is a great power within partnership, when the partners themselves realise that they too are the leaders of the organisation. It's very difficult to sum up 3 years of work in a series of bullet points. But I believe it boils down to 5 broad themes. And the first of all is the concept of the leadership constellation, understanding that there is an informal power structure that sits alongside and overlaps the formal authority structure. The second broad theme coming out of the research is the power that lies in ambiguity. What my research shows is that ambiguity is something that can be embraced and actively used to your own advantage as a leader because it can be a source of power for you. The significance of social embeddedness has emerged as another very important theme in my research. High levels of trust can both help and hinder the effective functioning of the leadership dynamics. But in the absence of social embeddedness, the same kind of trust can be manufactured through social control systems. I've also identified the prevalence of politics within these organisations. Ultimately, building consensus in a professional service firm is about bargaining, it's about negotiating, it's about trade-offs, it's about doing deals. These are all political skills. But it's very important that the leaders of these firms appear apolitical, appear to be acting in the best interests of others, which is ultimately the act of a supremely effective politician. And the final theme is the healing power of partnership. Now, this isn't going to happen all the time, but often enough, when things go wrong, new leaders will emerge to take responsibility for repairing the damage, and that is one of the great strengths of a professional service firm.
She takes incredibly complex concepts, huge amounts of research, and she manages to distill it down to 4 or 5 insights, which are really, really powerful.
What really resonated with me about Laura's lecture was the issue of ambiguity in leadership. I've worked both in professional service firms and also in the corporate sector. The corporate sector, there's much less ambiguity between formal power structures and informal power structures. When you're working in professional service firms, they may or may not coincide, and being able to navigate through those more ambiguous power structures is absolutely key.
The one thing that surprised me mostly about Laura's lecture this evening was her discussion about the firm that had both everyone as a leader and no one as a leader. It was an interesting concept. I've seen some of the other stuff before, but that was something new that I hadn't really heard expressed in that particular way.
She has a very subtle and acute ear for the relationships and the language and the personalities involved in these firms. She's been studying them for a long time, of course.
You can draw an organisation chart, but that only gives you part of the story in terms of how a firm is really run. And if you're in management, I think understanding the informal power sources are really, really important.
She has pulled out such explicit information from what is implicit in a professional services practice.
I think I was surprised perhaps by how acute the observations were. And Laura rightly said that it's like holding up a mirror and you look in the mirror and go, oh, is that really what I look like? And I kind of know I do, but I don't necessarily want to admit that to myself. And it did feel a little bit like that, but no, it's a great piece of research.
Sometimes when you've completed a research study, it's tempting to think, oh, well, that's done. Now I want to look at the next big adventure. I think I'm going to be studying leadership for years to come in the context of professional service firms because it is so complex, so fascinating, and so important. Intellectually, it is incredibly challenging, but also incredibly exciting. These are real people grappling with immensely complex and sometimes very, very painful problems. But what I'm able to do through my research and through my consulting work is to hold a mirror up to these organisations and say, this is what you look like, this is why it's happening this way, and then I can begin to work with them to help them to change it.